The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was a cold Tuesday morning, the kind that seemed to bring an even deeper chill into the courthouse, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of decades of cases and decisions. At 9:30 a.m., Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe, preparing himself for another day of cases. At 62 years old, with graying hair and tired eyes, he had spent 25 years on the bench, believing he had seen it all. His steady routine, though sometimes monotonous, gave him a sense of control, a sense of certainty in a job that was often unpredictable. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activities. Clerks rushed through the marble hallways, arms full of files and papers, while lawyers in expensive suits whispered quietly to their clients, preparing them for the long day ahead. In the gallery, the wooden benches filled up with people waiting for their cases to be called, many of them resigned to the slow pace of the legal process. Sarah Chin, Judge Sterling's clerk for the past 3 years, had a well-practiced routine herself. She organized the day's files on his desk with precision, ensuring everything was in order before the cases began. She paused for a moment when she reached one particular file, a case that made her frown slightly. Something in the details of the case caught her attention. There was something she didn't like about it, but before she could voice her concerns, Judge Sterling waved her away with a brief motion of his hand. "Let's get started," he said in his usual firm tone, his voice carrying the weight of the authority he had cultivated over decades. The first few cases of the morning moved quickly as expected. They were typical matters of traffic violations and minor offenses, the kinds of cases Judge Sterling had handled countless times before. He addressed each one with mechanical efficiency, barely looking up from his papers. His reputation for being strict, especially with certain defendants, was well known throughout the Philadelphia legal community. Though no one dared to openly discuss it, there were murmurs behind closed doors about the judge's unwavering tendencies, his propensity to lean toward harsh sentences, particularly when it came to those he considered to be disrespectful or uncooperative. He often gave little leeway, and many attorneys had learned not to argue too strongly when before him, especially if they knew the case wasn't likely to sway his opinion. At 10:45 a.m., Sarah called out the next case. Docket number 2024 County Route 789 Commonwealth vs. Dr. Maya Washington. A woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She was dressed in a navy blue business suit, her natural hair neatly styled, and she carried herself with the composure of someone used to high-pressure situations. At 42 years old, Dr. Washington had the kind of presence that usually commanded respect in any room she entered. She was a well-respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital, and anyone who knew her knew that she was not the type to be involved in trivial matters. But here she was, facing a traffic violation in a courtroom, an event that, by all rights, seemed out of place for someone of her stature. But Judge Sterling barely looked up from the papers in front of him. He shuffled through the case files, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he scanned the documents, not even acknowledging Dr. Washington's presence as she stood before him. "Your Honor," began Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, his voice steady and calm, "my client is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The missed court date was due to an emergency surgery that couldn't wait. We have documentation to support this." Reed's words hung in the air, his attempt to provide context, to explain the situation. But Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple, Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who had heard too many excuses over the years. "Your client failed to appear for a court date and then argued with an officer of the law when he attempted to serve the bench warrant." His words were cold, precise, and final. He wasn't interested in hearing the details or the explanations. Dr. Washington stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture impeccable despite the exhaustion she must have felt after performing back-to-back brain surgeries for 18 hours the previous day. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at her fatigue, but her voice remained steady, calm. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she began, but Judge Sterling's sharp glance silenced her before she could finish. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington," he said, his words deliberately emphasizing the Ms. as if to remind her of her place, to remind her that he had the power in this room, not her. He briefly glanced at her file again, but his disinterest was evident. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of his disapproval, and the gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. Lawyers who had finished their own cases stayed to watch, their attention piqued by the tension that had begun to build in the room. They exchanged knowing glances, each familiar with Judge Sterling's patterns. This wasn't the first time something small had turned into something much larger in his courtroom. A simple traffic violation, a minor error, could quickly snowball into something more serious when Judge Sterling was involved. Sarah's chin shifted uncomfortably at her desk. She noticed something in Dr. Washington's file, something important that Judge Sterling had overlooked. But she hesitated. Interrupting a judge, especially during sentencing, was almost unheard of. Years of courtroom protocol had taught her to remain silent, to stay out of the way. And yet she knew what was coming. She had seen this before. She had seen the way the judge often escalated minor offenses into larger issues, particularly when it came to defendants he deemed disrespectful or uncooperative. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as Judge Sterling began his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Miss Washington," he said, his voice booming in the otherwise silent room. "Your disregard for the law and your subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." His words were harsh, delivered without a hint of sympathy. He continued, his tone growing more forceful. "Your original violation was minor, but your actions since then have made this a much more serious matter." As Judge Sterling spoke, Dr. Washington remained composed, her gaze steady. But her attorney, Thomas Reed, stood up quickly, his voice growing more urgent. "Your Honor, if we could submit evidence of the emergency surgery that caused the missed court date, I think you'll see that my client's actions were not intentional, but rather born out of the pressure of her medical profession." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote a note to the judge, knew she had to act fast. Something was different this time. She had seen enough to know that the judge's decision was about to be made, but there was a piece of information in the file that he hadn't seen. It was a small detail, one that, if known, could change everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Judge Sterling's stern face as he leaned forward in his high-backed chair. Dr. Washington stood perfectly still before him, her exhaustion hidden behind a mask of professional dignity. Sarah's heart raced. She had to speak up. This time she couldn't just sit back and watch. But would the judge listen? Would he even care? As the room waited for the judge's decision, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. No one, least of all Judge Sterling, realized that the next few moments would change everything. "Counselor," Judge Sterling cut him off sharply, his voice laced with impatience. "You've had your chance to speak. The time for explanations has passed." His fingers drummed on the polished surface of his desk, a habit that revealed his growing frustration. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes to those who had seen him in action over the years. Judge Sterling prided himself on his efficiency and his ability to maintain control over the courtroom. When someone challenged that control, especially someone who seemed to defy his expectations, it gnawed at him as if his authority were being questioned. Dr. Maya Washington stood before him, her back straight, her gaze unwavering, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the weight of the moment. She had spent the last 18 hours in the operating room performing back-to-back brain surgeries, saving the lives of 2 patients. A teenage boy with an aggressive brain tumor and an elderly woman with a hemorrhage, both of whom would have died if she hadn't missed her court date. But in the eyes of Judge Sterling, all of that was irrelevant. She had broken the law. She had missed an appointment in his courtroom and now she had to pay the price. That was the way he saw it, the way he had always seen it. As his decision loomed, Dr. Washington's mind drifted briefly to those 2 patients. She could still see their faces, one pale with fear, the other showing the quiet terror that comes with the knowledge of impending death. In those quiet moments before surgery, she had promised them both that she would do everything in her power to help them. It was a promise she kept. Yet here she was, facing the full wrath of the court for something that, to her, seemed trivial in comparison to the lives she had just saved. "The court sentences you to 30 days in county jail," Judge Sterling announced, his voice firm, causing a collective gasp to rise from the gallery. "Plus a fine of $5,000. His words landed like heavy stones in the still air, the silence that followed stretching long and uncomfortable. No one in the room seemed to know how to respond. But then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the tension like a thunderclap. "Your Honor." Sarah Chen's voice rang out, urgent and filled with an emotion that was rare in a courtroom. In her 15 years as a court clerk, Sarah had never once interrupted a judge. The very idea was almost unheard of. But now, with her hands trembling from the weight of what she knew, Sarah couldn't stay silent. She rushed forward, almost tripping over her sensible shoes as she clutched the note she had written. Judge Sterling turned sharply, his face flushing red at the interruption. Miss Chin, he began, his tone low and threatening. What is the meaning of this? He stood, his expression livid, clearly unaccustomed to anyone challenging his authority in this manner. But Sarah had already placed the note on his desk, the words scrawled in her neat handwriting now hurried and desperate. She had to act fast. As the note settled in front of him, Judge Sterling glanced down at it. His usual stern demeanor faltered as he read the words. The note was brief, but it carried a weight that Sarah knew he would feel. Dr. Maya Washington, Chief of Neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October. Your granddaughter's emergency surgery. The color drained from Judge Sterling's face as he read those words. For a moment he couldn't process them. His hand, which was usually steady, began to tremble slightly. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. His memories flooded back. Memories of his 16-year-old granddaughter, Emma. He remembered the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the frantic drive to the hospital, the hours spent waiting in that sterile, lifeless waiting room. He recalled the endless minutes spent staring at the clock, watching the hands slowly tick by as they waited for news. Then at 3 a.m., it was Dr. Washington who emerged from the operating room, still in her scrubs, her face tired but resolute. She's going to make a full recovery, Dr. Washington had said, and in that moment the world had felt lighter, the air less suffocating. Emma would live. It was a gift, a second chance at life, a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. Judge Sterling's voice faltered as he finally spoke her name, his proper title for the first time that morning. Dr. Washington, he said, his tone softer now, almost reverential. I remember Emma. Yes, I remember her well. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily, the quiet strength she carried in the operating room now evident in the way she stood before the judge. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed, she said, her voice calm despite the storm of emotions that must have been swirling inside her. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments. I'm glad to hear she's still doing well, Your Honor. The silence in the courtroom thickened. Judge Sterling's hands moved instinctively to remove his reading glasses, revealing eyes that suddenly seemed much older and more troubled. He stared at Dr. Washington for a moment, his mind racing as the familiar walls of his prejudices began to crack, letting in uncomfortable rays of truth. How many people had he judged in this way, he wondered? How many times had he allowed his assumptions to shape his decisions without truly understanding the lives of the people standing before him? Sarah Chin stepped back to her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done what needed to be done, but now the full weight of the moment was pressing on her. In the gallery, the lawyers who had stayed behind exchanged meaningful glances. They too knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would not be forgotten easily. In the balance between justice and prejudice, the scales had shifted, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For 30 long seconds, Judge Sterling remained completely still, his face a mixture of shock and realization. The only sound in the courtroom was the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint clatter of footsteps in the hallway outside. The judge's mind raced back to that terrible night in the hospital, to the face of his granddaughter lying unconscious in that sterile hospital room. Emma. His beloved granddaughter who had nearly been lost to him. And it was Dr. Washington, the very woman standing before him now, who had saved her. Your Honor, Thomas Reed's voice gently broke through the judge's thoughts, his words careful and respectful. Perhaps we could take a brief recess? Judge Sterling cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if trying to steady himself. Yes, a 15-minute recess, he said, his voice sounding different now, softer, more uncertain. Dr. Washington, please remain in the courtroom. We'll resume shortly. As the gallery emptied, whispers filled the air. Court officers stood awkwardly by the doors, sensing the unusual tension in the room. Sarah buzzed herself, organizing papers, though her eyes kept darting between the judge and Dr. Washington. Once the courtroom was mostly empty, Judge Sterling stood. He no longer seemed like the stern, unyielding figure who had presided over the room just moments ago. Instead, he appeared older, more human, and somehow more vulnerable. He took a few steps down from the bench and stopped in front of Dr. Washington, his voice suddenly heavy with emotion. Dr. Washington, he began, his tone almost apologetic. I owe you an apology, not just for today but... He paused, struggling for words that did not come easily. Would you join me in my chambers? Your attorney is welcome to accompany us. In his chambers, the morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting stripes of sunshine across the dark wooden desk. Family photos lined the shelves, one of Emma at her recent soccer championship, alive and smiling because of the woman sitting before him now. Emma showed me her trophy last month during her final checkup, Dr. Washington said softly, nodding toward the photo of the smiling teenager. She's made a remarkable recovery. Judge Sterling picked up the photo, his hands trembling slightly. She wouldn't be alive without you, he said quietly, setting the frame back down. He faced Dr. Washington directly now, his voice filled with a newfound humility. And this morning, without even looking at you properly, I was ready to send you to jail. Dr. Washington regarded him steadily, her eyes calm but filled with understanding. Your Honor, she said, her voice low but firm, what happened this morning is about more than just me. It's about every person who stands in your courtroom. Judge Sterling sank back into his chair, the weight of her words hitting him hard. How many others had he judged unfairly? How many times had he allowed his biases and assumptions to cloud his judgment? This expanded version deepens the emotional stakes and context of the scene while maintaining the original narrative. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments. Dr. Maya Washington took a deep breath, her shoulders still carrying the weight of an exhausting night on the operating table. She had performed 2 emergency surgeries that evening, one on a 17-year-old boy named Marcus, who had suffered a traumatic brain injury, and the other on an elderly woman named Ruth, whose life was saved after a massive hemorrhage. Both were alive this morning. Both had been given a second chance at life, thanks to her skill and dedication. That was why she had missed her original court date 3 months ago. She had been in the operating room saving lives, just as she had always done. But in the eyes of Judge Sterling, none of that seemed to matter. As the judge had made his initial decision to sentence her to jail time, Dr. Washington could feel her anger rise. How could he not understand? He hadn't seen what she had seen, the fear in Marcus's eyes, the desperation of Ruth's family, the uncertainty of life on the operating table. He hadn't experienced the long hours of surgery, the decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. To him, all that mattered was her missing a court date. But now, as Judge Sterling sat quietly before her, something had shifted in the air. The sharpness of his words had softened. A deeper understanding had begun to take root. She watched him carefully, her posture still upright but slightly more relaxed now that she could see his walls beginning to crack. He had glanced at the medical documentation she had provided earlier, documents that he had initially refused to review. As his eyes moved over the pages, Dr. Washington could see the change in his demeanor. Each page told a story of lives saved, of families kept whole, all because she had chosen to put her patients first, no matter the cost. She hadn't asked for recognition, but it was clear that the reality of her work was starting to take hold of the judge. Just then, Sarah Chin knocked softly at the door and entered with a stack of files, her presence a welcome interruption. Your Honor, she said, walking toward the judge's desk, I took the liberty of pulling some of your recent cases. There's a pattern you might want to see. The judge nodded slowly, his attention shifting to the files she had brought. It was as if, with each new case, a new layer of understanding was being peeled away. Sarah's words had struck a chord. He had seen the pattern before, but he had been too blind to recognize it. Now the evidence lay before him, undeniable and unyielding. He had not just been wrong about Dr. Washington. His decisions had affected countless lives over the years. As Sarah placed the files in front of him, Judge Sterling began to process the weight of the situation. The morning sun had risen fully now, filling the room with bright, unforgiving light. It was as if the sun itself had come to bear witness to his revelations, illuminating the darkness he had tried to avoid for so long. The clarity of the daylight brought with it a moment of reckoning. The judge could no longer hide from the truth about himself. The biases, the assumptions, the judgments he had made without truly understanding the human beings who stood before him. The question now was, what would he do with this newfound awareness? How would he reconcile his actions with the truth of what he had learned? Dr. Washington observed him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the internal battle unfold on the judge's face. This moment was critical. This could either be a turning point, a moment of genuine change, or just another missed opportunity for growth. She knew that the next few minutes would determine which path Judge Sterling would choose. Would he recognize the significance of the moment, or would he fall back on his old ways? That evening, as the sun began to set and the weight of the day's events settled in, Judge Marcus Sterling found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files. The only light in the room came from the desk lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., but his mind refused to quiet. It kept racing back to the events of the morning, to the moment when he had nearly sentenced Dr. Washington to jail, to the realization that had shaken him to his core. On his desk lay two photographs. The first showed his granddaughter Emma, smiling brightly as she scored a goal in her recent soccer match. It was a moment that would never have happened if Dr. Washington hadn't saved her life. The second was a copy of Dr. Washington's medical credentials, printed out by Sarah Chin. They were a testament to decades of education, countless lives saved, and numerous awards for her work in impoverished communities. These two images, one personal, one professional, held an undeniable weight. They were symbols of what had nearly been lost, and what had nearly been destroyed by his own bias. "Marcus, are you coming to bed?" His wife Linda appeared in the doorway, her voice soft with concern. She knew the look on her husband's face all too well. It was the look he got when something had shaken him to his very foundation. She was no stranger to this. Over the years, Linda had watched as her husband's commitment to justice and fairness had become clouded by the weight of his own prejudices. But she had never seen him this lost, this uncertain. "I almost sentenced her to jail, Linda," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the photographs before him. His voice was filled with shame. "The same doctor who saved Emma's life. I didn't even look at her properly. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the painful truth. The shame of it hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. Linda stepped into the room, her presence a quiet comfort. She sat across from him, her gaze steady and compassionate. "Tell me what happened," she said gently. And so he did. He told her everything: the morning's courtroom session, the harsh words he had spoken to Dr. Washington, the realization that had hit him like a bolt of lightning. Meanwhile, across town at Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Washington was finishing another long shift. She stood at the nurse's station, updating patient charts, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the morning. She couldn't help but replay the moment in the courtroom when she had stood before Judge Sterling, when she had seen the shift in his eyes. He had finally recognized her. Not as a doctor, not as an expert in her field, but as a human being. A young resident approached her with a small, hand-drawn card. "Dr. Washington," the resident said, "the family of Marcus Thompson, your surgery patient from last night, wanted you to have this." She took the card, feeling the weight of the small, crumpled paper in her hands. It was a simple drawing, a picture of herself drawn by Marcus's little sister. Beneath it, in wobbly letters, was the message, "Thank you for saving my big brother." The innocence of the drawing, the sincerity of the message, brought tears to Dr. Washington's eyes. This was why she had chosen this path. Despite the long hours, despite the injustices she sometimes faced, this was the reason she did what she did. For moments like these. Back in his office, Judge Sterling was pulling files from past cases. Sarah's words about patterns echoed in his mind, and as he began to make notes, the evidence became undeniable. The notes he had made formed two columns on the legal pad, one with cases where he had followed his instincts, unchecked by bias, and one where he had made judgments clouded by his assumptions. The contrast was stark, and it made him sick to his stomach. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Grandpa, Mom told me what happened today. Drive W is amazing, isn't she? She checks on me every time I have a follow-up. She even came to my soccer game last month." Judge Sterling's hands shook as he read the message, the weight of his granddaughter's words sinking in. He remembered Dr. Washington's words from that morning. What happened today is about more than just mean. In that moment, he felt the truth of it. At midnight, Dr. Washington sat down at her desk after finishing her final patient notes. A news alert popped up on her screen, a headline about another story of bias in the justice system. She clicked on it, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought again about Judge Sterling's face that morning. About the moment when his carefully constructed walls had finally cracked. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, her graduation day from medical school. She was the only black woman in her class, and she could still hear her mother's voice from that day. "Baby, you're not just becoming a doctor. You're becoming a mirror that shows people their own prejudices." Meanwhile, Judge Sterling was still awake. He walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, but Linda was already there, waiting for him. She slid 2 cups of tea toward him, her gesture both comforting and wise. "Remember what my father used to say?" Linda asked, her voice gentle. "The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself." Judge Sterling nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "I've spent 25 years on the bench, Linda. How many lives have I affected? How many Dr. Washingtons have stood before me, and I never saw them for who they really were?" In the quiet of that late hour, Both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington sat in their separate places, contemplating change. Judge Sterling opened his laptop and began to type a letter to the State Judicial Review Board, acknowledging his failings and requesting a review of his conduct. Dr. Washington finished her patient notes and added one more thing to her schedule: a lecture on bias in healthcare and the justice system. Both of them had come to a turning point, but neither of them could ignore the fact that they had been given a second chance to make a difference. The night grew deeper, but for both of them, something new was beginning. Sometimes, it takes a mirror to show us who we really are. And sometimes, that mirror comes in the form of a person we almost wronged. By dawn, the sun would rise on a new day, bringing with it the promise of a fresh start. Both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington would face their own reflections again, but now they were a little more aware of the weight their actions carried, and the power they had to create change. This version provides more narrative depth, capturing the internal transformation of both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington, along with their reflections on justice, bias, and the moments that shape us. Certainly. Here's an expanded and rewritten version of the paragraph, incorporating more depth into the narrative and character development. It had been an unrelenting day for Judge Marcus Sterling. He had been at his desk since dawn, tirelessly sifting through years of court records, trying to make sense of what he had overlooked for so long. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him, the steady ticking of the clock a constant reminder of the time slipping away. Sarah Chin stood nearby, adding yet another stack of files to the already crowded desk. The papers piled higher, a physical manifestation of the emotional and ethical burden that was beginning to overwhelm the judge. "That's the last 5 years of cases, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. She had been with him throughout this difficult process, organizing the files into a color-coded system to help him identify any patterns that might emerge. Red for harsh sentences, yellow for moderate, and green for lenient ones. The system, though simple, had become a revelation in the hands of a man who had once prided himself on his fairness. As he picked up the first file, he was immediately struck by the undeniable pattern that unfolded before him. The red tabs, which marked the harshest sentences, appeared far too frequently in the files of minority defendants. It was something he had never noticed before, something he had never allowed himself to see. His heart grew heavy as he picked up one of the red-tagged files. The name on it was familiar. James Carter, an African-American, age 19, first-time offense for shoplifting. He had given him 6 months in jail. His voice grew heavy as he muttered the details under his breath. "I gave him 6 months. The injustice was clear in hindsight, but it wasn't just James Carter's case. It was a pattern that continued to unfold with every file he reviewed. The next case was a stark contrast. Michael Brooks, a white male, age 20, same charge, same circumstances, yet Sterling had given him only 3 months probation. There was no rational explanation for the disparity, no reasonable justification for the different treatment. The weight of his decisions, of the lives he had impacted with his biases, felt suffocating. Sarah stood in the background, watching her boss. The proud man who had once believed in his own infallibility, now questioned every judgment he had ever made. The confident judge who had ruled with unwavering certainty was gone, replaced by someone who was finally willing to face the uncomfortable truths about himself. The realization that he had been blind to the biases within the system, and in himself, was humbling, if not outright devastating. Across town at Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Maya Washington was making her morning rounds, checking in on patients who had just undergone surgery. As she moved from bed to bed, her phone buzzed in her pocket, distracting her momentarily from her work. She pulled it out to check the notification. It was an email from the State Judicial Review Board, requesting her presence at a hearing. The email stated that Judge Sterling had reported himself for bias in his sentencing, and her case had been cited as one of the examples that had brought this issue to light. She read the message twice, her heart skipping a beat. This was unexpected, to say the least. Her nurse, Jenny, who had been with her through countless long shifts, noticed her surprise. "Everything okay, Drive W?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Dr. Washington gave her a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, Jenny. Just unexpected news. Sometimes people can surprise you in good ways." She looked back at the email, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She had always worked hard to help her patients, to improve lives, but the fact that her experience had prompted such a reflection in Judge Sterling was both surprising and humbling. Back at the courthouse, Judge Sterling was in a meeting with Judge Maria Rodriguez, a respected colleague known for her fair and just rulings. Maria had been a sounding board for him throughout his journey of self-reflection, and now she sat across from him, reviewing the findings he had compiled. "What you're doing is brave, Marcus," she said, her voice steady but filled with empathy, "but it's also going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Some of your colleagues won't thank you for shining this light on the system." Sterling nodded, his eyes downcast. He had spent years dismissing concerns about bias in the courts, refusing to acknowledge the inequities that were all too apparent to those on the outside. Now, the consequences of his blindness were staring him in the face. "Maria," he said, his voice quiet, "I've been wrong for so long. Last week, I almost sent a brilliant surgeon to jail because I couldn't see past my own prejudice. How many others have I wronged?" Maria's expression softened, understanding the weight of his words. "You can't change the past, Marcus, but you're doing the right thing now. That's what matters." The road ahead would not be easy, but Sterling was determined to face it. He spent the rest of the day meeting with other judges, legal scholars and civil rights attorneys. Each meeting was more difficult than the last as he confronted the reality of how deep the biases ran within the system. But he did not shy away from these uncomfortable conversations. He needed to hear the truth no matter how painful it might be. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington received another surprising call. The local bar association had reached out, inviting her to speak at their upcoming conference about her experiences with the justice system. At first she had hesitated. "I'm a surgeon, not a public speaker," she told her colleague Dr. James Chen during their lunch break. But Dr. Chen's response made her reconsider. "Maybe that's exactly why you should do it. You can help them see the person behind the defendant's table, Maya. You can help them understand what it's really like." Back at the courthouse, Sarah Chen brought Judge Sterling his afternoon coffee, noticing the intense focus with which he was reviewing video recordings of his past court sessions. The recordings showed patterns he had never noticed before. His different tones of voice, his body language, the rush with which he had passed judgment. It was all laid bare before him and it was impossible to ignore. "Your Honor," Sarah said carefully, "Channel 7 News has been calling. They've heard about your self-review and want to do a story." Sterling shook his head, dismissing the idea immediately. "This isn't about publicity, Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is about fixing what I broke." He picked up another file, his eyes scanning the details. "Look at this one, Sandra Thompson. Denied bail for a minor offense. A single mother who lost her job because of my decision." The weight of each file, each case was starting to sink in. More files came to his desk, each one revealing another instance of how his biases had shaped his rulings. With each new case, the list of mistakes grew longer, but he didn't stop. As the day wore on, his office began to resemble a war room, with files spread out across every surface, sticky notes covering the walls. Sarah had stayed late to help him, feeling as though she was part of something important, something that could make a real difference. "We'll need to review at least 10 years of cases," Sterling said, rubbing his tired eyes. And then? Sarah asked, her voice filled with quiet anticipation. "Then we start making things right," he replied, picking up his phone to make another call to the review board. Outside his window, the sunset painted Philadelphia's skyline in rich shades of orange and purple. It was a reminder that even as the day ended, there was still more work to be done. Later that evening, Dr. Washington sat in her office, finishing up her patient notes. She had made the decision to accept the Bar Association's invitation. Change, she realized, didn't happen overnight, it happened one conversation at a time. The next day at the Philadelphia County Courthouse, the largest meeting room was packed. Judge Sterling stood at the podium, facing over 200 people, former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and fellow judges. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting light across his face and highlighting the nervous sweat on his forehead. "My name is Marcus Sterling," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "For 25 years I've served as a judge in this courthouse. And for 25 years I've been part of the problem." He paused, taking in the faces before him. Today that changes. Behind him, a screen displayed the statistics he had uncovered. "We've reviewed over 3,000 of my past cases," he continued, pointing to the data. "The evidence of my bias is clear and undeniable. African American defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. Latino defendants faced higher bail amounts. Asian Americans were more often denied interpreters." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in recognition of their own experiences. Others sat shocked, their faces pale as they absorbed the information. But Sterling wasn't done. "Numbers don't tell the whole story," he said, his voice growing stronger. Behind each case is a person whose life I affected. James Carter lost his scholarship because of my harsh sentence. Maria Gonzalez's children went into foster care because I denied her bail. David Chen's restaurant closed when I refused to consider his family circumstances. In the audience, some people wiped away tears, while others sat with straight backs, their faces etched with years of pain. I can't undo the past, Sterling admitted. But I can work to make it right. He gestured toward a team of lawyers sitting at a side table. Starting today, we're launching the Sterling Review Initiative. Certainly. Here's the rewritten paragraph expanded into approximately 1,100 words, with more depth added to the characters and themes. Judge Marcus Sterling's voice, steady and firm, echoed through the crowded room as he stood before a captivated audience, his eyes scanning the faces of former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and his fellow judges. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air as he continued, laying bare the truth he had spent so many years avoiding. Every case where my bias affected the outcome will be reviewed, he declared. We have partnered with the Public Defender's Office and private law firms who will work pro bono to help overturn unjust sentences. The room grew quiet, the silence punctuated by the rustling of papers and the soft murmur of agreement from some of the audience members. Dr. Maya Washington, seated in the front row, watched the proceedings with a mixture of admiration and personal reflection. She remembered her own experience in his courtroom, how close she had come to being just another name on a long list of lives disrupted by the prejudice that permeated the justice system. The vulnerability in Judge Sterling's words was something she hadn't expected, but it was exactly the kind of acknowledgement that could lead to real change. The judge continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. We've also established a compensation fund, he said, the weight of the admission in his tone unmistakable. I'm selling my vacation home and contributing my own savings to it. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. There was a pause in the room as people absorbed his words. Some of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their skepticism about the viability of his plan evident in the furrows of their brows. But there was no denying the gravity of what he was proposing. Judge Sterling motioned for Sarah Chin, his dedicated assistant, to approach the podium. She walked up, carrying a stack of files with green stickers attached, cases already identified for immediate review. These were not the files he had spent the past weeks agonizing over, but the beginning of the next phase of their work. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Sarah spoke, her voice calm but filled with the resolve that had driven them to this point. The work has already begun, she said. These are cases where the evidence of bias is clear. They will be reviewed first. Judge Sterling turned to face the audience once more, his gaze now directed squarely at his fellow judges. The biggest change, he said, his voice unwavering, must be in how we move forward. I'm working with the Judicial Review Board to create new guidelines for checking bias in sentencing. Every judge will be required to review their own patterns twice a year. We cannot afford to continue down the same path. His words hung in the air, and the discomfort in the room was palpable. For those who had long held their positions of power, the notion of admitting fault and altering the way they operated was anathema to the culture they had cultivated. Sarah looked out over the audience, noticing the body language of the judges seated in the back rows, crossed arms, furrowed brows, and the tight set of their jaws. She knew that change would be difficult, especially for those who had never once questioned their own decisions. But she also knew that the system was at a tipping point. It wasn't just about correcting the past, it was about ensuring that the future would be different. Judge Sterling was no longer just a man in a black robe. He was the embodiment of a system that could evolve, if only people had the courage to confront its flaws. As the presentation drew to a close, the audience lined up to speak with the judge. Each person had a story to tell, an experience in court, a life changed forever by a single judgment. Judge Sterling listened carefully to each one, jotting down names, case numbers, and the specifics of their accounts. Gone were the days of rushing through cases, treating people as mere numbers on a docket. Now he was truly listening, his pen moving swiftly across the page as he captured the details that would guide the next steps in his efforts to make amends. Dr. Washington approached the judge last, her steps slow as she made her way through the sea of people. When she reached him, she extended her hand, her grip firm yet warm. That couldn't have been easy, she said softly. Judge Sterling shook her hand, his own grip steady but laden with a depth of gratitude. The easy path led me wrong for 25 years, doctor, he replied, his voice tinged with remorse. It's time for the harder road. Outside the courthouse, news crews had gathered, cameras flashing as the story began to spread across the city. A judge admitting his own bias. a judge working to amend the mistakes of a lifetime. Some called it career suicide, others hailed it as a watershed moment for the judicial system. In his chambers, Judge Sterling sat down with the first group of lawyers who would begin reviewing his old cases. The task ahead was enormous, but for the first time in his career, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his gavel. He wasn't just serving the law anymore, he was serving justice. Dr. Washington returned to her hospital, still processing the weight of what she had witnessed. As she stepped into her office, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a colleague at another courthouse in another city. They had heard about the Sterling Initiative, and they wanted to learn more about how to implement a similar program in their own jurisdiction. The message was a small confirmation of what Dr. Washington had already suspected. Change was possible. And like a pebble thrown into water, the ripples of the Sterling Initiative were beginning to spread across the country. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the lights dimmed, Sarah Chin found Judge Sterling still at his desk, absorbed in the files before him. His office, once neat and orderly, now looked like a war room, papers strewn across every surface, sticky notes on every wall. The real work was just beginning, but they were moving forward, one step at a time. 3 months after Judge Sterling's public admission of bias, the Philadelphia Judicial Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. The conference, titled Breaking Bias, Healthcare and Justice, had attracted judges, lawyers, medical professionals, and advocates from across the country. Dr. Washington stood at the podium, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the crowd. "Medicine and justice have something important in common," she began. "In both fields, our biases can mean the difference between life and death, freedom or imprisonment." In the front row, Judge Sterling sat with Sarah Chin, both of them taking notes as Dr. Washington continued. "6 months ago, I was almost sent to jail for a traffic violation," she said, showing a slide of her operating room. "The same day, I had saved 2 lives through emergency surgery. But in that courtroom, none of that mattered. I wasn't seen as Dr. Washington, the neurosurgeon. I was just another face that fit someone's prejudiced expectations." The audience shifted uncomfortably as they recognized their own biases in her words. At the back of the room, Emma, Judge Sterling's granddaughter, sat with her parents, now fully recovered from the brain surgery Dr. Washington had performed. Emma watched as the doctor who had saved her life shared her story. It was a story of healing not just in the operating room but in the system itself. "But this story," Dr. Washington said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "isn't just about one judge or one doctor. It's about the choices we make every day. In the ER, I can't choose which patients deserve care based on how they look. And in a courtroom, justice must be equally blind." She clicked to the next slide, showing the results of the Sterling Initiative's first 3 months. 157 cases reviewed. 89 sentences reduced or overturned. $1.2 million in compensation distributed. 23 other judges voluntarily joining the review process. The crowd was silent, taking in the magnitude of what had been accomplished in such a short amount of time. Judge Sterling stood up, joining Dr. Washington at the podium. "We discovered something powerful," he said, his voice now full of conviction. "When we admit our mistakes and work to fix them, people trust the system more. In the past 3 months, court appearances have gone up. People believe they might actually get a fair hearing." Sarah Chin presented the next part of the data, showing how they had transformed the daily operations of the courts. Every judge now had a bias check system. Case reviews happened monthly, not yearly. Public defenders received more resources to ensure fair representation for all. During the lunch break, Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling walked through the hospital halls together, stopping by the pediatric ward where some of Dr. Washington's young patients were recovering. "Remember what you told me that day in your chambers?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "About not being able to undo the past?" Sterling nodded, his eyes following a young child in a wheelchair practicing walking with a physical therapist. "In medicine," Dr. Washington continued, "we can't undo damage either. But we can help heal. We can help people move forward. And that's what you're doing with the initiative." Back at the conference, the afternoon session focused on practical changes, with courts from across the country sharing their plans to adopt similar programs. Medical schools discussed new training initiatives to address bias in healthcare. Law schools presented updated curricula designed to root out prejudice in the legal system. For the final panel, Emma joined Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling, sharing her story from both sides, as a patient saved by Dr. Washington and as the granddaughter of a judge who had learned to change. "My grandfather taught me that being strong means admitting when you're wrong," she said, her voice steady. And Dr. Washington showed me that every person deserves to be seen for who they really are. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in as the ripple of change continued to spread, one story at a time. This expanded version captures the ongoing evolution in the story, with greater emotional depth and a clearer narrative arc for the characters. As the day drew to a close, Dr. Maya Washington received unexpected news. 5 more cities had reached out to inquire about starting their own bias review programs, inspired by the work that had begun with Judge Marcus Sterling's initiative. Judge Sterling, meanwhile, was in the courthouse parking lot, shaking hands with more judges who had volunteered to review their past cases. The momentum was undeniable, the ripple effect growing stronger with every passing day. That evening, as Dr. Washington walked out of the courthouse, she caught up with Judge Sterling, who had just finished a meeting. They stood side by side in the dimming light, looking out over the bustling streets of the city, both feeling the weight of the progress they had made. "We're making progress," Dr. Washington said, her voice filled with both pride and a quiet resolve. "But there's still so much work to do." Judge Sterling nodded, a mixture of exhaustion and hope in his expression. "Yes," he agreed. "But now we're doing it together. Doctors, judges, lawyers, communities, all of us learning to see each other clearly." They stood in silence for a moment, their gazes directed toward 2 buildings that stood as symbols of the power they sought to change. On one side was the hospital, its windows aglow with the soft lights of patient rooms, the lifeblood of care and healing. On the other, the courthouse, where late-working lawyers moved between offices, their figures illuminated by the glow of desk lamps, the very place where lives had been changed forever by decisions made behind closed doors. 2 institutions, each holding its own weight in society, each now slowly learning to serve everyone equally. The next day, as both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington returned to their respective work, there was no illusion that the road ahead would be easy. There were more cases to be reviewed, more surgeries to perform, and countless opportunities to either perpetuate the biases they were fighting against or to confront them head-on. But something fundamental had shifted. There was now a path forward, a path that both of them were committed to walking, one that they didn't have to walk alone. It had been 1 year since that pivotal morning in Courtroom 304, and the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. had drawn over 1,000 attendees. Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling stood backstage together, preparing for their keynote speech. The weight of the moment was palpable, especially for Dr. Washington, whose pulse quickened as she watched Judge Sterling adjust his tie for the 3rd time. "Nervous?" she asked, offering him a smile to ease the tension. "A little," he admitted, his eyes scanning the crowd through the curtain. "A year ago I was just a judge who thought I knew everything. Now I'm speaking to judges from all 50 states about everything I got wrong." Dr. Washington chuckled softly, knowing the feeling all too well. The same woman who had stood before him just a year ago, her future hanging in the balance, was now preparing to speak to a crowd of professionals, all of them eager to hear about the changes that had swept through the judicial system. They were no longer just a judge and a doctor. They were now partners in a movement that was rewriting the very fabric of how justice was served in America. Through the curtain they could see Emma, now 17, sitting in the front row. Emma had become an active speaker at high schools, sharing her own experience with bias and justice. Her voice had become one of the loudest advocates for reform, and she had become a symbol of what could be achieved when systems of power began to reflect true fairness. Next to Emma sat Sarah Chin, who had recently been promoted to Chief Court Administrator. Her new position had been created specifically to oversee the bias prevention programs that had spread from Judge Sterling's courtroom to courts across the country. The work that had begun with just a single judge's admission of fault was now a national movement, and Sarah was at the forefront of overseeing its continued expansion. When the conference host approached the podium, the crowd hushed, and the spotlight shifted to Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling. "Today's speakers need no introduction," the host said, his voice filled with admiration. "Their story has inspired change in courts across America. Please welcome Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington." As they walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the room. Behind them, a large screen displayed the numbers that told their story, a story that had now reached a historic scale. 1,247 cases reviewed and corrected. 37 states adopting similar programs. $4.5 million in compensation distributed. 89% reduction in sentencing disparities in participating courts. The data was powerful, but it was the human stories behind those numbers that had changed lives. "Good afternoon," Dr. Washington began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. 1 year ago, I stood in a courtroom facing jail time for a traffic violation. Today, I stand before you as a partner in change. She paused, turning to look at Judge Sterling. But this isn't just about two people, she continued. It's about all the lives touched by bias and all the lives now being touched by reform. Judge Sterling stepped forward, his face thoughtful as he spoke. The hardest moment in any judge's life, he said, is admitting we've been wrong. But the most important moment is deciding to make it right. Together, they presented a video montage showcasing the impact of their work. The footage included heartwarming stories from across the country. A young man graduating college after his unjust conviction was overturned, a grandmother starting a new business with the compensation she had received, and doctors and judges working together to address bias in both professions. But in the middle of their presentation, something unexpected happened. Breaking news flashed on everyone's phones. The U.S. Supreme Court had just announced new national guidelines for bias review in all federal courts, and the guidelines were directly inspired by the Sterling Initiative. Sarah Chin hurried backstage, holding a phone with the news release in her hand. She handed it to Dr. Washington, who read it aloud to the audience. Her voice trembled with emotion as she shared the news. The justice system must reflect the truth that every human being deserves to be seen, heard, and judged fairly. The room erupted in applause, but Dr. Washington's eyes were already on the next step. There was so much more to be done, and the moment of celebration was brief. After the main presentation, Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling led workshops. Judges shared their experiences with implementing reform, public defenders discussed improved resources, and medical professionals talked about the parallel changes being made in healthcare. Dr. Washington led a session on emergency room bias and the necessity for fair treatment in surgery. We can't choose our patients based on how they look, she explained. In justice, you can't choose who deserves fair treatment either. Everyone deserves the same care, the same justice, the same respect. During lunch, Emma joined them at their table. She showed Dr. Washington and Judge Sterling her phone, her eyes glowing with excitement. "Grandpa," she said, "my story about you and Dr. Washington just won the National High School Essay Contest. They want to publish it in law journals." Judge Sterling hugged his granddaughter tightly, overwhelmed with emotion. He thought of how close he had come to losing her, how his own prejudices had nearly caused irreversible harm to the very person who had saved her life. Now here she was, a powerful voice for change in her own right. Later that afternoon, as the conference neared its end, an unexpected honor was bestowed upon Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington. The National Judicial College announced a new annual award, the Sterling Washington Prize for Judicial Reform, recognizing judges who worked to eliminate bias in their courts. "This award isn't for me," Judge Sterling said during the ceremony. "It's for every person who stood in my courtroom and didn't receive the justice they deserved. It's for every judge willing to look in the mirror and change. It's for every Dr. Washington who persists despite the barriers we put in their way." As they left the conference center later that evening, a group of young law students waited to talk to them. They were eager to learn from the pioneers of this new movement, the next generation of judges and lawyers. One of the students asked, "Do you ever regret that morning in court?" Dr. Washington looked at Judge Sterling, then at Emma, and finally back at the student. Her response was thoughtful, a lesson she had learned through her own journey. "That morning showed us that change is possible," she said. "When we see each other clearly, when we admit our mistakes and work to make things right, that's when justice becomes real." As they walked into the cool Washington evening, passing the Supreme Court building with its words carved in stone, "Equal justice under law," they felt the truth of those words in a way they never had before. Something had shifted, something deeper and more human than before. The story wasn't over. But now, it belonged to everyone willing to look in the mirror and choose to change.